Welcome to Revise and Resubmit, where we take cutting-edge research and try to break it down so you don't have to. I'm Pavlov, and with me as always,
Nikita. We're ready to, dive into another fascinating topic today. This time, we're looking at irregular migration to Europe, specifically the experiences of Pakistani migrants. And we've got a really insightful article from the Journal of Management Studies to guide us. It's called, get this, Desperate Journeys to Europe, Sensebreaking in Extreme Contexts.
Ooh, that title alone is pretty powerful.
Right. It was published in 2025, and it's based on interviews with, get this, 52 Pakistani migrants who actually undertook these journeys, which, as we'll get into, are often incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, when you hear migrant journeys, it's easy to kind of gloss over the reality.
Totally. But these researchers really get into the nitty-gritty of what these individuals face.
And I think what's so valuable is that they connect it to something we can all relate to, this idea of how we make sense of the world, especially when things go very wrong.
Okay, so that's where this sense-breaking thing comes in. I gotta admit, when I first saw that term, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it.
Yeah, it's not your everyday word, is it?
Not at all. So before we dive into the specifics, can you give us like a sort of high-level overview of what sense-breaking even means?
Sure. So basically, sense-breaking is this profound disconnect between your expectations and the reality you're facing, right?
That expectation versus reality gap.
Exactly.
Like, okay, imagine you think you're signing up for a relaxing cruise, and then you end up crammed onto a tiny, dangerous boat.
Oh, yeah. And I'm not just making that up, by the way. The article specifically highlights how that's off of the reality for these migrants.
Wow, that's just setting the scene in a very stark way.
Yeah. And what the researchers found is that this disconnect, this sense-breaking, it can really shatter your assumptions about the world and make it super hard to even imagine a positive future.
Okay, so it's not just about feeling sad or scared in the moment. It's like this deeper loss of how you understand your whole experience, past, present, and future.
Right. And what's interesting is they break this down into two types: sense-breaking with the past and sense-breaking with the future.
Oh, hold on. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that even mean?
Okay, so think about it, right? You have expectations going into something tough and hopes for what comes after. But when things go drastically wrong, those expectations get blown out of the water.
And not just metaphorically in this case?
Sadly, no. So sense-breaking with the past is when your past experiences, your assumptions about how the world works, they no longer hold true. And that can be incredibly disorienting.
I can imagine, yeah.
And then you have sense-breaking with the future, which is the struggle to even imagine a positive future. Because the present is so difficult, so overwhelming.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah.
How do people actually feel when they're experiencing this sense-breaking?
So the researchers found that this intense emotional cocktail of fear, anxiety, regret, all of that, it often leads to two very specific states: derealization and disorientation.
Ooh, those sound intense.
They are.
Tell us more.
So derealization, think of it like your brain hitting the pause button on reality. Things feel so surreal, so unbelievable, that you disconnect from what's happening, almost like you're watching your own life on a movie screen. You see it, but it doesn't feel real.
Wow, I can almost see how that could be like a coping mechanism, right? To protect yourself from just how overwhelming things are.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's disorientation, which is that feeling of utter confusion, not knowing where you are, what to do next, literally and figuratively lost.
So you're not only dealing with the actual dangers of the journey, but also this internal sense of being completely unmoored.
Exactly. And here's another thing that makes it even harder. These journeys are full of what the researchers call liminal periods.
Liminal period.
Yeah, basically these long stretches of waiting for transport, for smugglers, for documents, just waiting for any kind of stability.
Ugh, it's like being stuck in this horrible in-between space, never knowing what's next. I bet that just amplifies the anxiety and the sense-breaking even more.
You are so right. These liminal periods are brutal for the migrants. They're forced to dwell on the past, worry about the future. There's a sense of uncertainty and fear. It just grows.
Makes sense. It's like when you're waiting for important news and you can't help but overthink everything. It's that same kind of energy, but magnified 1,000-fold, I imagine.
Exactly. These periods aren't just physical hardship. They're psychological torture. And for many of these migrants, it can last for weeks, months, even years.
It's like being stuck in limbo, never knowing what's next or when your life will truly begin. This is also heartbreaking, but I gotta admit, even though these experiences are extreme, I'm starting to see how this idea of sense-breaking could apply to anyone facing major life challenges. It's making me think about times I've felt stuck or lost, even if it wasn't as intense as what these migrants are going through.
Absolutely, and that's why this research is so valuable, I think. It shows how these very specific, very intense experiences tap into something universal about the human experience. The feelings of fear, uncertainty, that feeling of being disoriented. Those are things we can all relate to on some level.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're starting to see the human side of these experiences. But before we go further, I'd love to hear some specific stories from the migrants themselves to really understand how this sense-breaking plays out in real life.
Great idea. The researchers captured some incredibly powerful stories in their interviews. Stories that really illustrate how these emotional and physical disruptions all kind of come together to create this sense of being completely unmoored.
Oh, I'm all ears. Lay it on us.
All right, so one migrant named Rizwan, he described this terrifying boat trip across the Mediterranean.
Ooh, this is where it gets real.
Right. So Rizwan, he had no idea he'd be traveling by sea, and the conditions were far, far worse than he imagined. He describes the boat flying 10 feet in the air because of the waves. He said he saw death up close.
Wow, that image is just terrifying. I can't even imagine the fear he must have felt. I mean, talk about expectation versus reality.
Right. That's sense-breaking in action. And it wasn't just the boat trip. Later on, Rizwan was crammed into this tiny compartment near the fuel tank of a van with 4 other people. He thought he was going to die.
It's like one thing after another, this constant barrage of horrifying experiences. It makes you wonder how anyone could process all of that.
And what's striking is how much Rizwan emphasizes the emotional side of it. You know, he talks about feeling fear, shock, anxiety, even regret. It wasn't just a physical discomfort, but the emotional turmoil that really got to him.
Like a vicious cycle, right? The more terrifying the experience, the harder it is to process. And the deeper you spiral into that sense of disorientation and fear.
Exactly. And Rizwan wasn't alone. Another migrant, Babar, he described being jailed in Macedonia for 2 weeks, where he was severely beaten. He talked about his feet being so frozen after hiding in sewage pipes that he thought they would fall off.
That's horrific. And we're only just scratching the surface here.
We are. There's so much more to unpack, especially when it comes to these liminal periods, those stretches of waiting and uncertainty. That, as we've said, can be even more challenging than the journey itself.
Yeah, I'm really curious to dig deeper into that and to understand, what keeps these individuals going, what drives them to endure such hardship.
Well, that's where we're headed next. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore the specific challenges of those liminal periods, the ways in which time itself becomes distorted during these experiences, and ultimately we'll start to uncover what drives these individuals to risk everything for a chance at a better life.
Okay, so we've been talking about these harrowing journeys, the psychological toll they take, but you mentioned something really interesting, that these liminal periods, these stretches of waiting and uncertainty, can actually be more difficult than the journey itself. I gotta say, that seems a bit counterintuitive. Why is that?
It is fascinating, isn't it? You'd think, like, the active danger, the actual physical risks would be the toughest part. But yeah, the research suggests these liminal periods can be just incredibly tough on people. Imagine it, like constantly being on edge, never knowing what's next. When you'll finally reach some kind of stability, it's like, I don't know, waiting for exam results or something. But it can go on for weeks, months, even years.
So it's not just the physical hardship, it's this constant psychological pressure cooker of not knowing. No wonder it just amplifies the sense breaking.
Exactly, yeah. During these times, your mind can really become your own worst enemy. You have all this time to replay traumatic experiences, to worry about the future, to question everything. And for many of these Pakistani migrants, their liminal periods are filled with exploitation, abuse. They're often undocumented, which makes them incredibly vulnerable to unscrupulous employers, authorities.
We heard about Rizwan and Babar's experiences earlier. Were there any other stories that really stood out to you, particularly related to these liminal periods?
One that really stuck with me was Bilal's story. He was stuck working in Turkey, trying to save enough money to continue his journey to Greece. And he thought, the worst was behind him. But he ended up facing even more hardship and exploitation in Turkey.
It's like the sense breaking never really ends, right?
Yeah.
Just when you think you've caught a break, something else comes along to shatter those hopes.
Exactly. And sadly, Bilal's story isn't unique. So many migrants find themselves trapped in these cycles of hope and despair. They risk everything, endure unimaginable hardship, only to find themselves back where they started, their dreams kind of crushed against the reality of the situation.
You mentioned earlier that these liminal periods could sometimes last for years. Did any of the migrants talk about what that feels like to be stuck in this kind of limbo for so long?
Yeah, one migrant, Hisham, he talked about waiting for legal authorization to live and work in Greece for almost 11 years.
11 years.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. He described feeling trapped, like a servant, working 18 hours a day, little sleep, treated less than human. He said, he'd spend so much money and time. Going back to Pakistan seemed impossible. But he also felt like he had no hope for the future in Greece either.
That's incredibly sad. It's like those years just chipped away at his very sense of self, his belief in a better future.
It's heartbreaking, and it wasn't just Hisham. The researchers found that these extended periods of waiting, they often led to really profound feelings of hopelessness and despair. It's like their dreams, their aspirations were just slowly suffocated under the weight of this never-ending uncertainty.
It makes you wonder, if they're constantly facing these reminders of trauma and disappointment, how can they ever truly heal and move on? It seems like even reaching their destination doesn't guarantee a sense of peace or stability.
That's such a crucial point, because even if they make it to Europe, they often face a whole new set of challenges, right? Whoa. Discrimination, exploitation, the constant fear of being caught and deported. It's like they can never truly escape that sense of precarity and uncertainty that just defines their lives.
We've been talking about how these liminal periods are like a psychological pressure cooker. You also mentioned that time itself becomes distorted during these experiences. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure, think about it. When you're in a prolonged state of stress and uncertainty, your perception of time, it gets all messed up. Minutes can feel like hours, days like weeks. And at the same time, you might feel like years are slipping away, like you're losing precious time that you can never get back. That's what these migrants were describing, this warping of time. That added another layer of disorientation and distress to their experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely experienced that, like time dragging on when I'm anxiously waiting for something. But I imagine in these situations, it's magnified tenfold. Did any of the migrants talk about how this time distortion affected them specifically?
Oh, yeah. Several of them described this feeling of time both slowing down and speeding up simultaneously. Like one guy, Atif, who was stuck in a refugee camp in Italy, he said it felt like he'd been there for years, even though it had only been a few months. He was so desperate to start his new life, but he felt trapped in this time warp, unable to move forward.
It's like they're living in this strange in-between space where the normal rules of time just don't apply.
Exactly. And this distortion of time, it just contributes to their sense of disorientation, of being lost. Not just literally in terms of their location, but also figuratively. They lose their bearings in terms of their place in the world, their sense of self.
So we're seeing how these liminal periods, combined with this warping of time, create a perfect storm for this prolonged sense-breaking, right? It's a pretty bleak picture, to be honest. But before we get too bogged down in the darkness, I'm curious, is there ever a positive side to this sense-breaking? Could it ever lead to something good?
That's a fantastic question. And it's one that the research doesn't really address directly, to be honest. Mm-hmm. It focuses primarily on the negative aspects of sense-breaking, understandably so. But I think it's worth considering. When our old ways of understanding the world are shattered like that, it can sometimes create space for new, more empowering perspectives to emerge. It's like that saying, you got to break down before you can build yourself back up.
I like that. So maybe, just maybe, some of these migrants, despite all the hardship and trauma, might find a way to use these experiences to grow, to develop a deeper understanding of themselves and the world.
Absolutely, it's possible. And it's something I'd love to explore further, actually. Maybe there's a way to harness this disruptive power of sense-breaking for positive transformation, But that's a conversation for another time, perhaps.
We've covered a lot of ground here, exploring the complexities of these liminal periods, the time distortion, even the potential for positive outcomes from sense-breaking. But ultimately, I think the question remains, why do they keep going? Why endure all this hardship and risk?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's the question that lies at the heart of this whole issue. And that's what we'll explore in our final segment. We'll delve into the motivations behind these desperate journeys, the dreams and aspirations that fuel them, and the complex interplay of factors that drive these individuals to risk everything for a chance at a better life.
All right, so we've gone deep into these journeys, the sense-breaking, the liminal periods, all of that. But now it's time to really tackle the most fundamental question here. Why? Why do they do it? Why embark on such a perilous journey knowing the risks, the suffering, the potential for everything to go wrong?
It's a question that demands that we look beyond simple answers. It requires real empathy and understanding to grasp the complex forces at play. In the case of these Pakistani migrants, their motivations are often rooted in this deep desire for a better life. But it goes far beyond simply escaping poverty or war, for example.
So what are we talking about here? What does a better life actually mean in this context?
Well, for many of them, it's about economic opportunities, of course. Improving their social standing, being able to provide for their families in ways that just don't seem possible in Pakistan. They're driven by aspiration, by a hunger for something more than what their current circumstances allow,
It's like they're reaching for a future that feels completely out of reach in their homeland. It kind of reminds me of like the American dream, that the idea of upward mobility, achieving success through hard work. But I imagine for these migrants, the stakes are much, much higher. And the path is just infinitely more treacherous.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about individual ambition either.
Yeah.
Their motivations are often deeply intertwined with these cultural and societal factors as well. The researchers found that a lot of the migrants came from rural areas where opportunities were limited. And they saw migration to Europe as a way to break free from those constraints, like achieving success abroad. It was seen as a way to bring honor to their family, to elevate their social standing back home.
So there's this strong sense of like familial duty at play, this desire to uplift not just themselves, but their entire family line. That's a heavy burden to carry.
It is. Yeah. And it's a double-edged sword in a way, right? Because that sense of responsibility can be this incredibly powerful motivator, but it can also make it almost impossible to turn back, even when faced with just insurmountable challenges.
Yeah, it's easy to sit here and judge these migrants for taking such risks, I think. But when you consider the cultural and societal pressures, the economic limitations, and this profound desire to create a better future for their loved ones, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Right, and we can't forget the power of hope either. A lot of these migrants, they've heard stories, perhaps exaggerated stories, of others who've made the journey and found success in Europe. And these stories, whether true or embellished, they become like these beacons of hope, guiding them through the darkness and giving them the strength to just keep going.
I guess that's what makes these journeys so desperate in a way, right? It's not just about escaping something bad. It's about this desperate reach for something better, this unwavering belief that a brighter future is possible no matter the cost.
Exactly. It's this complex mix of desperation, aspiration, and just this unwavering hope that fuels these journeys. And I think it's a powerful reminder that human migration is rarely a simple equation. It's driven by these deeply personal and often very desperate circumstances that demand our empathy and understanding.
This whole deep dive has really challenged my own assumptions about irregular migration, I gotta say. It's easy to get caught up in the political rhetoric, the statistics, the headlines, but we often forget the human stories at the heart of this issue.
That's so true. It's crucial to remember that behind the policy debates and border control measures, there are real people with hopes and dreams, with families, and this deep, deep longing for a better life. These aren't just, faceless migrants. They're individuals with complex motivations and stories that deserve to be heard.
This has been a truly thought-provoking conversation. We've gone from the depths of despair and disorientation to these glimpses of hope and resilience. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you'd like our listeners to really remember?
I think that the most important takeaway is that while these journeys are extraordinary in their intensity and the danger involved, the underlying psychological and emotional experiences are something we can all relate to on some level. We've all faced challenges, felt lost, disoriented, struggled to make sense of a world that doesn't meet our expectations.
It's a powerful reminder that we're all human, all navigating this complex world as best we can. And sometimes that means facing these incredibly difficult choices, right? Driven by forces both within and beyond our control. Well, listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of irregular migration and sense-breaking. It's been a journey of discovery, both intellectually and emotionally. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this complex issue, and perhaps even a greater sense of empathy for those who are navigating these treacherous paths. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep keep your hearts open to the stories of those who are different from you.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.